Hi there, I'm Scott, and this is GreatScott Knitting, a podcast, episode 8. This is the second time I have attempted to record this particular episode. I recorded it about a week ago and never got around to editing and uploading it, and so I decided, you know what, I didn't really like how it was turning out, so we decided to start fresh. So here we are, starting fresh. It is Sunday, September 20th, 2020. Wow, God, I'm really out of it today. It is the day after Rosh Hashanah, so L'Shana Tova, Happy New Year, and may 5781 be better than 5780. Because Lord knows this past year has been a challenge. If you're a returning viewer, thank you so much for watching, and if you're a subscriber, thank you. If you're new to this podcast, welcome, and I hope you enjoy the content that you find here. It's been absolutely beautiful in Wichita today. I don't know what the temperature is, but it's perfectly gorgeous. The humidity's low, the temperature's beautiful. It's a lovely evening, and I'm sitting out in my backyard enjoying that weather. So with this beautiful weather, with this fall weather, which I absolutely love fall. Fall is my favorite season. With that comes, of course, wanting to knit, and so I have a lot of things on my needles, and not a lot of them getting done. Now, it's been 4 weeks, I noticed, since I actually published a podcast onto my channel. I've done some other content, but not an actual sit down and show you what I'm knitting and messing with in terms of fiber. So I apologize for that. I didn't realize that things had gotten so in the way and that so much time had passed. So, but here we are. I have several things on the needles, but not a lot of finished objects. I do have a few things because about a week and a half ago I was feeling the need to have something finished, have something to show for all the knitting that I was doing. So of course I put aside all the other knitting and cast on some other stuff, and basically a couple of hats, which are really quite simple and easy to knock out a hat in an evening, or maybe even a couple hats in an evening. This is the Ross hat by Ross Rochester of Smells Like Yarn, the podcast. If you haven't checked out his podcast, it's absolutely delightful. It is a must-see. So definitely check it out. He has a lovely hat pattern, which is in 4 different weights of yarn. I knit the chunky version for this, and what I did was I held 2 worsted weight yarns together to create this. And the yarn is Loops and Threads Impeccable Solids from Michaels, and it is in a yellow, which I think is called Butterscotch. The orange is Pumpkin, and the blue is Clear Blue. So this is straight from his pattern, and as you can see on my head, it's a little on the too big side. I can flip it up, which is okay, but I think it's really meant for someone with a much longer head than what I have. So I had to immediately cast on another hat, this time again in the clear blue and the pumpkin, doing some striping. And I started decreasing earlier so that it would fit my short little head. So I really like his patterns. And because I was inspired, I decided to cast on one more, and this time I knit a longer brim in 2x2 as opposed to his standard 3x1, and this way I can fold up the brim intentionally for the hat. Again, it hides the stripes, but that's okay. It'll make a nice winter hat. which, you know, it's 2020, and God knows what winter will bring this winter. So those are my actual finished objects. I do have a hoe, or a half-finished object. I do have one sock that I have completed. This was knit using Sockmatician's Toe-Up sock. It's a great pattern, actually more of a recipe than a pattern. It has a standard heel flap and gusset on the heel, but just really, really quite nice. I'll tell you what the yarn is when I talk about the other sock, which is still in progress, although it's coming close to being finished as well. So I'll soon have my actual first pair of socks completed, which will be really, really exciting and nice. So I do have a lot of dyeing that I've done, and not all of it have I produced documentation and video for. Sometimes I've kind of gotten into this. I'm going to do some dyeing that I record and share with you all, and then some dyeing that I just want to do to try a couple of things out. A couple of skeins of yarn that I do want to share are from the GreatScott Knitting Dyes Yarn episode 7. These are my fall colorways that I created. This one, or actually I'll start with the first one. These were all done, these two skeins of yarn are on a base of 75-25 merino nylon fingering weight yarn from Dyer Supplier. Is a 3-ply yarn and dyes up beautifully. I did this using Wilton's concentrated food color, but I did my own sugar sprinkles to create speckling on this. And as you can see, it speckled really quite nicely using those sugar sprinkles. I was really pleased with how this turned out. This particular skein I dyed with a base of brown, so just did a quick low immersion dyeing to get a tonal brown on the base, and then speckled in fall colors over the top of it. And so I think that turned out extremely nicely. I'm very pleased with that skein of yarn. The second one, I did not do a base color. I just did speckling and in just basic standard fall colors of browns and blacks, foresty greens and reds and oranges and yellows, and just a very sort of traditionally fall color palette. And this is how it turned out. The speckles are really quite nice on it as well. There's still a wash of color in areas, so I don't know, I'm really pleased with this one as well as a fall colorway. And so now that I've gotten into knitting socks, I can see me maybe knitting a couple pairs of fall socks out of these skeins of yarn, or possibly even putting them together into some kind of a project, because I think they will match up relatively nicely. As there's a lot of tones that are the same between these two, they're almost kind of could be into a fade set concept if I had one or two other skeins of yarn dyed up. So that's one project that I did share as on my channel. And then one other one that I shared on my channel is this. This is my 8th experiment, and this is on a base of Dyer Supplier Blueface Leicester Fingering Superwash. I hand painted this with Wilton's food coloring in Wilton's black, Wilton's crimson, and then of course didn't dye this section. This was for a project that my husband is working on for his hobby, and he wanted a knitted piece of cloth in red, black, and white. And so I decided, oh, well, you know what? Let me see if I can dye something up that will work. If not, I can go buy some other yarn. This did not work for what he needed. The blacks were not deep enough. The crimson wasn't red enough or bright enough. And the white wasn't white enough, and which is fine. And to top it off, the black broke, which I find this little spot absolutely gorgeous. I love, to me, this makes the whole skein of yarn. But it wasn't going to work for the project that he's working on, so I had to find some other yarn to do his project, but still have this lovely skein of yarn, which this will definitely go into a pair of socks. I'm really excited to see how that looks on a couple of socks for myself. So, a couple other things that I have dyed up. I dyed up some tonal yarn and then took an extra step that I shouldn't have taken. So I dyed up 3 skeins of yarn, just using Patton's worsted wool in their just basic natural color, and I did it in a blue, a sort of a foresty green, and a violet. And then they looked great, really sort of as they were, but then I went one step too far. I decided to speckle each one with the off colors. The speckling didn't work as well as I had hoped that it would. And the more I kind of sat on those skeins of yarn and kind of looked at them, because sometimes when I dye something, I don't like it immediately, but then I let it sit for a while and it grows on me, kind of like a fungus. Well, these weren't growing on me. So I realized, or I came to a conclusion that, sometimes less is more. And because I had gone into the more, I decided, well, let's go more. So what I did was I took the violet skein and I did a hard twist on that skein of yarn to twist it up, and then dyed it in the blue color that I had dyed the blue skein of yarn in, and it came out like this. So you have the violets, and then you have these big, the big splotches of blue that are in it. Now, there are some small green speckles here and there, but you really don't notice those as much because you really see the blue on top of this violet. So it's kind of ugly, but I think it'll look really interesting when knit up. So I'm kind of excited to throw these into a project to see how they're going to look. So the violet went into a blue bath. The blue skein of yarn went into the dark green bath. And so you have this blue skein of yarn with these big spots of that dark green on it, which I just find that kind of interesting. I don't know if I would say pretty, but I think it's going to make I think it's an interesting combination. Maybe it's an exploration in ugly. And of course, then there was the green. Now, this is the one I was most scared of, but I think it's my favorite. I took the dark green, which kind of looks like this, and over-dyed it in the violet with deep violet spots on it. And oddly enough, I think this one's my favorite because it just is the most egregious of the 3 skeins of yarn. But I really like it. So I'm really kind of wanting to knit these up, all 3, into a project. I had some Lions brand fisherman's wool in natural color that was just kind of floating around in my house. They were in my stash. And so I decided, you know what? Because that black broke over here into this lovely green sort of teal color, I wanted to know if I could get it to break on this non-superwash worsted weight yarn. And so I knit it up into a loose cake and put it into a strong concentrated dye bath with the black of black food, Wilton's food coloring, and started out with no acid and then slowly added acid in as it soaked up that color. And what it came out with was not broken. Well, I mean, it broke. I will say that it broke, but not in the way that I kind of had hoped, but definitely in a way that's pretty. It's definitely got the black that was on that outside, but then it goes into a lot of pinks and violets and a little bit of the teal and green and blue, but very, very little. And oddly enough, and this was something I did not expect, it did absorb color all the way to the center of that skein of yarn. And I have a feeling that that was due to the fact that it was a non-superwash yarn, and that the cake of yarn was very loosely wound. So I'd be interested to do something similar in a superwash yarn, or it may have also had to do with the fact that I didn't introduce any acid until about 20 minutes into the dye process, and then very, very little, and then added it very slowly as I went through. So those are a couple of sort of my ugly experiments, I'm calling them. The other night, I had trouble sleeping. I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning with this idea of dyeing a skein of tonal yarn because I'm still wanting to perfect a tonal dyeing process for myself that I like. And I had this idea of using one color or one color of dye, but in different concentrations, and starting off dyeing the whole thing in a very light colored base, and then loosely twisting that skein of yarn, and then going into a medium range of that color, and over dyeing with a twisted hank, and then doing it one more time with the 100% concentration. So I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning and did just that with a skein of non-superwash worsted weight yarn. And the colorway I used, or the color I used, was Wilton's Copper. And it really is nice. It's tonal, definitely tonal, but it is not a smooth tonal like you would get if you just did kettle dyeing. This is much more kind of like almost like being hand painted or speckled in its tonalities, because there's big splotches of the different types of color, which, I don't know, I think gives it some interest. Not exactly what I'm looking for in my tonal. Maybe I'm wanting something much more traditional in like kettle dyed tonality, which I may have to try, just go back to try that again. But I think this is really pretty, and I'm excited to see how this knits up. And then the night of Rosh Hashanah, I couldn't sleep because of the very sad news of the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I couldn't really go to sleep with that information or if that news floating around in my head. So I went to a happy place and pulled out another skein of non-superwash yarn to do a little bit of dyeing. And this one I just kind of, having just had my Rosh Hashanah meal with my neighbor and my husband, I was just thinking of the colors that came from, that sort of come out of that meal. Colors from like the pomegranate, that sort of burgundy, maroonish color, the color of the honey, the colors of the bread, apples, all these very interesting, muted colors, but definitely in that sort of fall spectrum. And so I came up with this. So I have this burgundy color. Yeah, this is the burgundy, which is sort of reminds me of pomegranate. This brown, which reminds me of the challah that was on the table. More of that burgundy. Some sort of orangish color, which reminds me of the honey that went on the apples, which I sort of have this pinkish red for the apples. And then over the top of all of that, I sprinkled some homemade sugar sprinkles in Wilton's black, which interestingly enough kind of breaks again into those greens, but did turn out to be dark enough to look like just black splotches. Which, I don't know, for me kind of is a good signifier. I mean, I think it's a really pretty skein of yarn. I really do. It's muted, and for, Rosh Hashanah 2020 or 5781, muted I think is a good idea. And all of the black splotches, the dark black splotches, could either signify the collective sins that we have committed over the year, or the mood that comes from the loss of a significant person in the world. However you might want to interpret those black splotches throughout this colorway. But yeah, I think this is really pretty. I look forward to knitting with it. And again, these two could be paired together as sort of a set, a fade set with each other. So those are my dyeing that I have. So I do have works in progress. So I'll start off with that sock, as I am getting very close to having that sock finished. Check my notes here to make sure I understand or remember which yarn I'm using. Oh, yes. So I'm using Barocco socks in the colorway of Idwal, and it's a very woolly wool. It's not very soft. It is simply a 75-25 wool. It's not merino wool. It's just wool and nylon blend. So I'm knitting this up on some number 2 US 2 needles, which I think is 2.75 millimeter, and 60 stitches around. I'm using again that Sockmatician's Toe Ups by Nathan Taylor, and it makes a perfectly fitted sock for my foot. But of course, I'm also using my yarn bowl that I got a couple of years back for my birthday. Oh, this is from 2015 from my friend Elizabeth, who hand painted this. And there's my little kitty cat. So that's my sock that I'm working on. I am working on a scarf pattern. This is a Van Dyke check scarf, which I am knitting. The Van Dyke check is out of Barbara Walker's A Treasury of Knitting, and it's I'll give you an. It's kind of hard to see; it blows out on the camera, but it's an interesting check pattern. The yarn is Red Heart with Love Metallic, which is a 99% acrylic yarn, 1% other, and that other is and you can see it on here. It's a red Stellina sparkly fiber that runs through the yarn. So it's really kind of pretty. Again, this will probably be either a gift or more than likely a donation to a local project for warmth over the winter. I have another sort of donation project that I'm working on, and this is the Scrunchable Scarf. The Scrunchable Scarf is by Susan McCone, and it's just a sort of a basic, almost a mistake rib scarf. But I, again, was playing around with dyeing some yarn and dyed basically a set of colors in reddish, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. And so it's going to be a rainbow scarf. And, you know, right now I'm getting near the end of my yellow section that I'll be able to move on to the other two. Again, this is this yarn is recycled from a sweater that I picked up at a Goodwill store. And it's an 80% wool, 20% nylon blend. So it took up the dye relatively nicely. The sweater that I knit it from was from a sort of a beige-ish, you know, nondescript color. So I decided to dye it up and see what I could get. And one other thing on the needles is my Castra shawl. The Castra shawl is by who is this by? The Castra shawl is by Anthony Casalena, and the yarn, I am surprised I don't have this listed. Oh no, here it is. The yarn is Audine Wool Sport Shine by Knit Crate. So it's a sport weight yarn. It's a Knit Crate subscription yarn that I got. This is at 80% merino, 20% tencel in the colorway of Sky, which is this speckled white, blue, or it's on a white base but with blue and violet speckles in it. It's really pretty. I think it'll work up really well in this pattern. The pattern relies a lot on short row knitting, back and forth with lots garter stitch in one section, and then basically an open work mesh lace in the other sections. So it'll look really cool. I'm really looking forward to being able to get to that. The project I was working on for my husband, I have completed it, but I cannot show it until he finishes his project, because it's an aspect of his project which is really quite large. And as soon as he finishes his project and has his videos and stuff uploaded to YouTube, I will come on and share with you that project and my little itty bitty bit of it. But it's a really cool project, so I'm looking forward to being able to share that with you. Acquisitions. Not much going on in terms of acquisitions. It's been very slow over the past month. I have picked up an order from Dyer Supplier of some undyed yarn, some Blueface Leicester, some Superwash Sport Merino, and some non-Superwash fingering weight yarn from Dyer Supplier. I picked up, again, some skeins of yarn from Michaels, the Patton's Classic wool, and some Lion brand fisherman's wool, just for playing around with dyeing experiments to kind of see what I want to do and how I want to do it. I have picked up a couple of patterns over the past month. One was the Sockmatician's Toe-Ups by Nathan Taylor. And the other one is a shawl pattern by Benjamin Matthews called Ribs and Arrows. I'm really interested in knitting this, and the impetus for dyeing some of the yarn that I have played with was basically this pattern. So I'm looking forward to dyeing up a couple of skeins of yarn for this pattern to start with. So I have the bare yarn. I just need to take the time to dye up the yarn that I'm wanting to do. And I'm probably going to turn that into an episode of Dye's Yarn in the future. So that's what I'm hoping to cast on, actually, over the next couple weeks, depending upon if I can get the yarn dyed in the next couple of weeks. So I've shared a little bit of what I've been up to over the past month. Again, painting my neighbor's house, watching a lot of the knitting blogs that I enjoy so much and are such an inspiration to me, reading up on yarn and what and all those, all sorts of things about yarn. And so I do want to share with you some of the things that I have learned about yarn. But first I'm going to take a quick little break, and I'll come back and share that with you. Hi there. So a little bit of change of venue. I'm back inside. It got really dark outside, so and I needed to do a little bit of prep for this first session of what I'm calling Yarn Everything I Should Probably Already Know. And so here's some things that I have learned along the way. So I have been reading the Book of Yarn by Clara Parks, and here's some things that I have gleaned from that reading. So here we go. And I just need to get my notes off to the side here. So fiber under a microscope, you'll see that it has scales. And so all of the different scales, and depending on the type of fiber, whether it's a protein-based fiber or even cellulose or man-made fibers, they have sort of a different look underneath the microscope. Protein fibers tend to have a lot of scales, things like wool, and then your other animals, alpaca, yak, and so on. These fibers help the wool especially, and protein fibers and animal fibers, helps them to bind together when you're spinning them, and so they stay together really well. So the different types of scales help with that. The scales also can help define how fine a fiber it is, whether it's like a merino, very smooth, very soft fiber is going to have lots and lots of scales, but they're going to be really small, whereas your coarser wools have fewer scales that tend to be larger. The scales also help trap air, so can make the fiber warmer. And it also is one of the aspects that leads to felting of wool. Especially when you have animal fibers that are agitated in water and that are dried quickly, you get that felting process. Some other things I have learned about wool is that it's hygroscopic, term that I had not heard before, but it simply means that wool, or that the fiber, is able to absorb water and retain water, and yet at the same time still feel dry and warm against the skin, even though it may be holding a lot of fiber, which makes sense because a lot of woolen objects were used by sailors and people in very wet climates to stay warm and dry. So starting down the process of talking about protein fibers, especially animal fibers first, wool, of course, is the most prevalent type of fiber that especially we use in the knitting and crochet world that are natural fibers. So sheep come in lots of different breeds, and each of these different breeds are going to bring with it different types of animal fiber that behave in different ways based on a lot of different things. So some generic aspects about wool: it's very breathable, it's flame retardant, and one of the reasons it's flame retardant is because it's hygroscopic. It maintains water. Highly resilient and extensible, meaning that if you stretch it, it's going to snap back into its original shape much more quickly and easily. We get wool primarily by shearing a sheep or cutting the hair off of a sheep. And one of the concepts that brings about is this concept of a staple length. So how often you shear a sheep can influence its staple length. Or the staple length is basically the length of the fiber that comes off of the animal. Tends to be the shorter the fiber, the finer or softer that fiber will feel. Longer fibers tend to be more durable, stronger. Things like a merino are going to have a shorter fiber versus, say, a blue-faced Leicester, which is a little bit longer of fiber and so is more durable. When you shear a sheep, you're going to get a fleece, which is basically that fiber, that bulk of fiber that comes off of that animal. And that fleece can often include things like vegetable matter, feces, dirt, and a key aspect of a lot of wool or a lot of sheep's hair, which is lanolin, which is something that is secreted by a sheep. And it sort of tends to be like a greasy substance that helps protect the skin from infections, from water, and it also helps keep the animal warm and protects it from the elements. The more finer fleece tend to have more lanolin. However, some wool is almost lanolin free and could technically be spun directly from the animal. Another aspect that one has to think about when you're talking about protein fibers especially, but really all fibers, are the micron, or how thick that fiber is in terms of its diameter. And that is usually measured in microns. And as you can see, like an Angora Rabbit has a micron that is rather small versus the human hair, which is quite large. The micron of a fiber really does determine how soft that fiber might feel. So, for example, a merino fiber has a very small micron, usually between like 18 and maybe 25 or 35. or 25 or 30, meaning it's relatively small and is going to feel really soft. Whereas, let's say other types of wool tend to have larger, or even human hair have a much larger micron count, and so therefore are going to feel much more coarse. Another thing you'll find with your fiber, especially your woolen fibers, is the crimp. The crimp is that natural wave of the fiber when it comes off of the animal. Different animals are going to have different types of crimps. Some of them are going to be more wavy, others might be more like ringlets. One aspect that I learned is that the smaller the crimp, the higher the loft or the fluffiness of that fiber. And also that means that it will trap a lot more air. Whereas your larger crimps or ringlets tend to be denser and stronger and reflect light better, so that makes them more lustrous. Superwash wools simply means that that wool has been treated in a way such that it can be machine washed without risking it being felted. This treatment usually simply means that the scales that are naturally on that woolen fiber have been reduced in some fashion, usually chemically, to make that fiber a bit more safe to be used in a washing machine. Often another aspect of superwash is that it affects how the wool will take up dye. For example, on a merino wool, the dye will adhere more quickly to the fiber on superwash wool than on a non-superwash wool. Some other very popular types of animal fibers are your mohair, which comes from the Angora goat. It's extremely soft, and however, with your mohair, the younger the animal is when it is shorn, or that the wool is collected, the fiber is collected, the softer that or finer that fiber is. The older the animal, the more coarse the fiber will be. You have your cashmere goats. Again, a cashmere goat basically has a dual coat. The outer coat tends to be coarser and have a larger micron, straighter and with less crimp and longer, whereas the undercoat is what you really go for with cashmere, which is a short staple length, much more a higher crimp, and a much finer micron to it. An Angora rabbit, as opposed to your Angora goat, Angora comes from the Angora rabbit, tends to be an extremely fine micron, very short fibers. Because the shortness of the fiber, it often requires a higher twist to the yarn that you're creating, or to the fiber you're creating. It's also tends to be very expensive because you only get about 8 ounces of fiber a year per animal, but they are awfully fluffy and pretty. Some other types of fibers that we often have are from the Camelid family, so your camel fibers. Now there are 2 types of camels. There's the one-hump dromedary and the 2-hump dromedary. The fiber that we use to in yarn tends to be from the Bactrian or 2-humped camel, which tends to be from northern climates, and of course is going to be hairier. Again, it has a dual coat, so the outer coat is used more for brushes, rugs, things of that nature, whereas the undercoat is used for your more finer and softer types of things. It's very similar to merino in its nature. Another camelid is your alpaca. Tends to be a longer staple length than your standard wool. It's very strong. However, it feels much more like a merino, so it's very soft. There's no lanolin, and it is harder to felt than 100% alpaca. And of course, then there's your llama. Again, another dual-coated animal. The undercoat is extremely soft. Has a lot of the same features as an alpaca. Your muskox gives us Kibute, which is a very soft, warm fiber. Again, your muskox is a dual-coated animal. The undercoat is what you go for. You only get that usually from the animal shedding, and so it's only going to happen one time a year, and you're not going to get a lot of that fiber. So naturally, Kibute is an expensive fiber. Similar to your yak, molts in the spring, has that underfiber that you want to go for, that has that short, good crimp, and yak is also very wool-like in its nature. And then, of course, being from Kansas, we have to talk about the American bison. The American bison has actually 4 different layers of coat, and there's 2 layers that actually can be used a lot for fiber production. That's the very delicate undercoat, which has a micron around 21 to 24. And then there's a coat that's beyond that, which is usually a micron of 30 to 32, which is also relatively soft. And then it has a couple of outer coats, which are very much more coarse and harder to use. Again, they molt in the spring. You don't often shear a bison. So you have to wait for them to drop their fiber, and then it has to be the coarser fibers have to be separated from the finer fibers, causing 100% bison wool yarn to be relatively expensive. I kind of did a little pricing out. For 1 ounce of lace weight yarn is $60. So, yeah, it's an expensive yarn. Silk is also a protein fiber, comes from the animal, the silkworm. However, silk is not grown on the animal. It is extruded by the animal in its production of the cocoon. There are actually a couple of different types of silk. There is the Bombix Silk, which is produced by the Bombix silkworm, or the Bombix mori, and its diet is almost exclusively mulberry leaves, which gives it this very lustrous white, very luminous nature to the fiber. There's also something called Tussa Silk, which is produced by wild silkworms that have a much wider, very appetite for different types of leaves. It's a bit stronger than your Bombix silk, but is also slightly coarser and a little bit duller in its finish. The fiber that is produced is actually a substance called silk fibroin, which is the liquid that is secreted by the silkworm. A secondary substance is also secreted when the silkworm creates the fibroin that helps harden that fiber on the cocoon around them, protecting them, but it also protects the fiber until it is washed. So there are, in the process of creating the fiber, the silkworm is gathered by a worker. The cocoons are then soaked to remove that outer hardening layer from the fiber, and then the fibers are drawn off of the cocoon and reeled. So you could actually work with raw silk directly from a cocoon, and you could actually spin. You could create yarns with it. You could knit with it. You could weave with it directly off of the cocoon. And so you have your difference between what is called reeled silk, which is directly from the cocoon, and then you have spun silk, which is then you take that reeled silk and spin it. So that's a lot of stuff that I learned about protein fibers and how they are created and made and used. A lot of these fibers are used in blends with wool, especially your other animal grown fibers, your yak, mohair, cashmere, silk are often combined with different types of wool to create different effects on your yarn. For example, when you add silk to a merino, you're going to get something that's much more luminescent, much more shiny than just a plain merino. Whereas if you were to add a bit of merino to your, say, an Angora, you're going to strengthen that Angora. It's going to be a stronger fiber, or stronger yarn, but it's going to have that fluffiness to it that you like when you have your Angoras, or your mohair for that matter. So I've learned quite a bit about protein fibers and how they're used. I've also learned that buying wool is a lot more economical than buying a lot of the other types of animal fibers that tend to be rarer and more expensive. So yeah, I'm enjoying so far this journey of learning a little bit more about the different animal fibers and how they, why they are used the way they are and how they are made up. So we have come to the end of this particular episode. Be sure to check out my other videos on my channel on dyeing, on when I unbox new yarns that I receive. Give me a shout out in the comments. Let me know what you liked, what you don't like. What do you want to see more of or less of? And also share what you're doing. Let me know what you're knitting, what some of your favorite go-to knitting is, and what some of your favorite patterns are, because I'm very interested in knowing some of those things, because might want to feature some of that. You can find me on social media. I have a Facebook page on Facebook, which is GreatScott Knitting, which is at www.facebook.com/GreatScottKnitting. I'm on Instagram as GreatScott Knitting, and I'm on Ravelry as GreatScott KCMO. So thank you for joining me today. Make sure you hit like if you enjoyed this particular episode. Hit subscribe if you want to see more of the content from this channel. And make sure you hit the little bell icon to be notified of when I upload new content. So until next time, please enjoy your knitting.